I grew up in England, um, in Wembley, till I was 11. And then I moved to Canada. My whole family moved to Canada, where I went to middle school and high school, and then went to Sheridan College to study animation. Um, and after that, I ended up moving out to LA to work at Nickelodeon and a whole bunch of the studios here, and have stayed in LA working in animation for 10 years now.
Okay.
And I got into comics around 2016. And since then, I've really enjoyed that as a creative platform. But what got me into art might have been that when I was younger, I'm the youngest of three, the youngest child. My brother used to play video games, and I used to just sit next to him because I was not as good as him, obviously being so much younger. And I would just draw usually what he was playing. So that's kind of my earliest memories of drawing and why I started seeing art as a potential career. So Cyclopedia Exotica, the reason I went with a Cyclops as the main inspiration, the main point of storytelling was that it kind of stemmed from this idea of being a monster, being pointed at, being stared at, and being treated as this other. So I had these monster origins, and I at first was playing around with a lot of different monsters, and I thought there was something really interesting in monsters and the erotic, and how, like, oh, if monsters existed, just like how different facets of humanity have come to be accepted in the broader sense through erotica, through like being sexualized. I thought it'd be interesting if monsters experience the same thing. And then as I continued drawing more and more, I had a real interest in the Cyclops, because I found it interesting that there's this monster that has very little technically that's different from us. In There's a lot of images of the Cyclops which make it huge, or makes it very, very monstrous, makes it very barbaric. But ultimately, there's one defining feature, and that is the one eye. And I found that very interesting, because it was such a defining point of how little it takes for us to regard something as different. And so rather than making it huge, rather than making it even more monstrous, I played those down and made them look just like us, except for that one defining feature. And then I made that the point of difference, just like skin color, I guess. Yeah, so many of my stories are in this book, as well as my friends, but I've always struggled with identity issues. Yeah, growing up in England, so funny enough, I actually grew up in large Indian communities in England and in Canada. So it wasn't always that my defining or my identity was different because I had brown skin. But I remember moving from England to Canada and realizing that I had an accent, and that everyone was saying, yeah, oh, say that again. And I realized I had this British accent, and I didn't want to feel different, especially when I was like 10, 11, because at that age all you want to do is fit in. And so that was like one of my first like realizations that, like, oh, I'm different. And then being in a school in high school, I was at large Indian community, but in all honesty, every one of my friends, all I think were going into medicine or science, and I was one of the only people who was interested in art. So there was this, again, identity dissonance going on, where I was like, oh, I don't know if like this is what I should do, or I didn't have that many people around me who I could go to for advice on how to do it better or where to study. So I've often felt like quite alone. And then that has been one of the hardest things about my identity, but also one of those championing efforts where I've learned to do things on my own. So when I moved down here to LA, this was the first time I lived in a predominantly white area. I hadn't realized how much it had even affected me, that growing up in England, I saw brown people all the time, in Canada all the time. And then when I moved out here, for the like seeing seeing a man with a turban and like pointing to be like, look, like there's another one. And it was so strange to me that I hadn't experienced that in so long. And I've always felt a little out of place. And that hasn't always been to do with my race, but sometimes, yeah, just my interests. But I feel like I'm coming, I guess I've come to terms with that. It's there's a lot of I guess, like you asked, how much of that is in the book. There's a lot of events which are almost like taken verbatim and put into this. There's a comic that takes place on the bus where this woman is talking about the Cyclops in front of her. And I had that experience on where someone was just one other Indian person were on the bus. And that was like, I mean, remember, it was not only hard because I experienced racism before, I've had racist things said to me, but I hadn't realized how much just ruin your day. Then on, and he was on the bus, which I had to take for work. I had this anxiety in me of like, oh, is that same person going to get on? And it took a really long time. The words that she had said, I mean, they didn't really affect me at the end of the day, because like when someone's saying such silly things, you just know that they must have their own issues. But it was just the idea that like I hadn't realized how casually it can completely ruin how much someone else doesn't have to experience that. So like those kinds of things, all of them are in here. And then also just like the nuances, the little things like the name pronunciations are in here. It all adds up, I guess, ultimately. And that was one of my ideas with making a book about microaggressions, was to just see how many that you eventually start feeling the weight of all of them. And when you see one page at a time, it's not that bad. But when you see all of them in a row, you start feeling like the weight of this book.